Hi! Today we're talking about poor people! Because whenever I talk about certain eras, about fashion history, there is always this one comment or a couple of comments going like, okay, but we're talking about wealthy people, but poor people surely didn't have time and finances to care about stuff like that. Kind of, but not quite. We often like to think about them as sort of like dirty beggars slaving their days away for a piece of bread. But the truth is, poverty obviously had a lot of different shapes and sizes and shades and colors. So some people were literally dying of hunger on the streets, and then some people were working away from a city on a quiet farm, and some other people were serving in giant households. So poor people is obviously quite a wide phrase. But was working hard enough to keep you away from the newest fashions? Well, of course not. Anyone freaking autofocus bit? Anyone less wealthy was obviously striving to look well. They were trying to look their best in order to appear wealthier, but also to kind of, you know, keep this dignity and a sense of self-worth. You know, if life is rough for you, sometimes your first intuition is to dress well in order to, you know, keep this last fort together. So it often wasn't until they hit the lowest layers of the society when they stopped caring about fashion, because simply they had some more pressing matters, such as what am I gonna eat today, or how am I gonna not freeze to death tonight? You know, stuff that kind of prevents you from caring about what you wear. But poor people wanted to look good, and one proof of that could be sumptuary laws. So throughout centuries, rich people's fashion had some elements and trends that were obviously unavailable to someone who was poor, but also not only financially, but sometimes they were prohibited by law. So let's say you were a servant of a silk merchant and you somehow managed to steal a roll of gorgeous silk and you wanted to make a dress. Would you be able to? Probably not. Because certain fabrics, trims, garments, sometimes even colors were prohibited by the law to lower classes, and that was something called sumptuary laws. Those laws were regulating expensive goods, including clothes, and they were often dictating what lower classes were allowed to wear and what they weren't allowed to wear, or even dictating what they should be wearing and what they should not be wearing. So depending on the country and the era, it could prevent you from wearing certain fabric, trims, particular garments. Even if you were a seamstress and you wanted to make yourself a fancy fashionable gown, you wouldn't be able to. At least not if you were living in 16th century England or something. So these laws kind of existed to prevent the lower classes looking the same as the higher classes, because you didn't want a beggar to pretend he is not a beggar. They were kind of like visual distinctions between classes. So you would have a look at a person and you were perfectly able to say which class they belonged to. And you didn't want someone to dress above their class. But I think the sole existence of those laws and how detailed they were shows that actually poor people wanted to look good and they wanted to dress fashionable, because otherwise what's the point of such detailed laws, you know, detailing even the colors, the shades, the trims that you were allowed to use. If the poor people were not trying to use those, I don't think you would have laws preventing them from doing that. You wouldn't need to be that precise. It is also true that poor people had their own fashion. Throughout the ages, some particular fabrics were locally sourced, some traditional clothing was involved, some practical solutions. It all created some pretty unique styles across Europe. And it's also important to know that up until, let's say, 18th century, fashion wasn't really unified. Like, you could clearly see someone's from England, someone's from some area in Germany, someone's from Eastern Europe, because all of the fashions kind of changed depending on the geographical area. So different countries and even different cities sometimes had their own fashion. So a 17th century Paris peasant looked different than a 17th century Brussels peasant and a 17th century Warsaw peasant. So when in, let's say, late 18th, early 19th century, fashion started to become more unified and you had this one particular silhouette that everyone followed, obviously with some modification, the mainstream fashion kind of got unified. The poor people, especially in the rural areas, were not obviously following these fashions closely. So they often stuck to the more traditional clothing, and that sometimes went well onto the 20th century. Traditional rural clothing of the poor people. But let's say we focus on those that were living in the cities. Did they follow the fashion closely, or was there some sort of a fashion delay? Was there a moment where poor women were dressed in fashions that were 20, 30 years old? So from my observations, it seems that yes, there was a delay, but it seems to have shortened throughout time, if you know what I mean. So for example, on early 17th century paintings, we see peasants dress in late 16th century style, and similarly when you have early 19th century paintings, you often have women dressed in, let's say, 1790s style. So the delay is there. It's an almost 20 years difference when it comes to fashion. But also there is this series of drawings of street sellers in England in 1804, and what they're wearing seems like kind of like old clothing adapted to the new silhouette. So they were definitely trying to do something. But generally speaking, you can see that the difference started to be smaller as fashion progressed. And by the end of the 20th century, it's only a couple of seasons difference in fashion. So for example, in the 1890s, like, you can tell the fashions are from like 1-2 years before, but definitely not 20 years. So what often happened was poor people would work with what they had. So clothing alterations were a massively common practice. Even rich people did it all the time because fabric was so expensive. Clothes were extremely expensive, so obviously if you had clothes made from a nice fabric, you would just alter it to kind of change it and adjust it to the new silhouette, to the new fashionable silhouette. So you can imagine how often the less wealthy altered their clothes. It could be down to changing the waist level, adjusting the sleeves, or completely taking the whole thing apart and trying to make it more fashionable than it actually is. Whatever you want. There was a lot of altering going on. Sometimes it was just down to changing the trimming that got kind of old-fashioned, and those serving in really rich households were kind of hoping that at some point the masters would give them their old clothing. Once it was too old-fashioned or worn down, it would be handed down to the staff. So you were kind of hoping for that, and then you could alter it to make it more fashionable. So with the fast growth of the clothing industry, this kind of like delay was less and less visible. Think Edwardian factory workers. Obviously their clothing is quite plain and simple compared to what the fashionable ladies wore, but the silhouette is kind of there. They're wearing the proper undergarments, the cut is there, the sleeves are where they're supposed to be, so the silhouette almost caught up with what was fashionable at the time. So another interesting point that is often brought up when discussing poor people's fashion is the undergarments. Would they wear corsets? Would they wear petticoats? Obviously, physical work is not very graceful when it comes to wearing a corset, and stuff that is impractical is not the best choice, obviously, when you're working hard. But the answer is yes, they would care about that. And there's a couple of reasons why they would. It's not vanity, it's more like it was a world where your appearance could make or break you. Similarly to today, you were instantly judged by the way you look. You could achieve a lot more if you dressed the part. And more often than not, looking put together and proper was a part of your job also, so you wouldn't want to risk that. And I'm not only talking about like shop assistants or office staff, but imagine you're a milkmaid and you just didn't feel like wearing a corset one day and it went kind of loose without petticoat and anything. And someone visits your mistress and sees you in the backyard and then complains that you look disorderly. The chain of thought was kind of simple. No corset equals most likely loose morality equals you probably flirted with a farmer's son equals you're a demoralizing person. And if the mistress decided to keep you after such complaint, this would kind of put her own morality into question. So obviously you would get fired. So why would you want to risk that? Why would you want to risk people thinking you're, I don't know, either poorer than you actually are, or worst of all, a whore? So I've examined a lot of excellent photographs from late 19th century, and it seems that actually most of working class women would wear corsets to their actual work. And it was kind of like an accepted norm. The only women deciding to drop corsets were women involved in some really like dangerous physical work, such as mining, for example, or basically just stuff where you literally had to wear pants and just forget about fashion altogether. So another kind of impractical element of women's fashion was long skirts, and people often wonder if working class women would wear long skirts to work, and actually they would. It's just that the skirts would be a couple of inches shorter than fashionable skirts. So for example, 19th century working class skirts would probably show their ankles at some point, but they wouldn't be extremely short as into their knees. So by modern standards, these these skirts were still quite long, but by their standards they were short enough to allow them to work properly. Sometimes the skirts were lifted up to reveal a more practical petticoat that you could get dirty and you wouldn't mind. Sometimes they were covered by aprons, so it depends on the style, on the fashion, on the era, whatever. I'm trying to cover like the whole fashion history here, so it's not easy, okay? It's one video. So summing up, yes, poor people did care about fashion, and they tried to follow fashion as much as they could. So despite sumptuary laws, despite how costly clothes were, and despite the impracticalities of fashion, they wanted to keep themselves well dressed and properly dressed, because at least this they could do. This was this one thing that could improve their situation. And it kind of reminds me of women's fashion during the Second World War, where obviously there was a lot of horrific circumstances, there was a lot of terrible stuff going around, and yet women decided to wear elegant clothing, to set their hair every day, to put so much effort into their appearance that it's a lot even by modern standards, just to kind of boost their morale. So I think that's the case with working class women and poor people in general, that keeping your appearance put together kind of put you in a better mood in a way. It allowed you to feel like you do have a control over your life, no matter how hard it would be. And I think they were also getting that morale boost from their looks. So this was a very short explanation of what poor people's fashion was like. And obviously there is a lot of different styles, and you know, sometimes even particular jobs had their different styles of fashion and clothing, but I'm not getting into that because it's getting dark, it's getting really dark. I actually think it would be a nice sewing project to recreate a poor outfit from, let's say, 19th century. Food for thought. My kitty is so sweet, you should see him! Ow! Are you poor?
For Pete's
Are
sake.
you a poor kitty?